Good morning, students. So today I'll be giving you an overview of about carbohydrates and its digestion and metabolism. So you must have studied in your previous class that carbohydrates are essentially the hydrates of carbon, and they are composed of the carbon and water, and have and generally we show their formula as CH2ON. So for glucose it would be C6H12O6. So this is the a major you know nutrition wherein we get our energy, and the major function is to provide energy. And and per gram of carbohydrate we derive about 4 kilocalories of energy. And there's no single carbohydrate which is essential, but the carbohydrates do have a lot of functions in our body in different ways. So how does these carbohydrate come, and what are the sources from where we get? And the major source of carbohydrate is plants. So plants by photosynthesis, it assimilates the sun's energy to make it one molecule of glucose. So basically for this we need the sunlight, in the form of which is the energy part. And then uh, we require carbon dioxide, water, and chlorophyll, wherein we get glucose. So 6 molecules of carbon dioxide with 6 molecules of water in the presence of sunlight gives rise to 1 molecule of glucose, which is C6H12 and O6. It's very interesting if you see, on a daily basis, about our brain requires about 120 grams of glucose, and which is about 480 calories. So we require a consistent supply of glucose for the whole day, even you are having food or you are not having food, or otherwise the brain will stop functioning. So if you look at the classification of carbohydrates, the carbohydrates are various types. The first one is simple sugars. So the simple sugars are nothing but we call them monosaccharides, as the name suggests. Mono means one unit, right? So the examples are glucose, galactose, and fructose. So the glucose and galactose are the aldose sugars, whereas the fructose is a ketose sugar. So the next one is disaccharides. So when two monomers, which are two monosaccharides, when they combine, so they give rise to the disaccharides. For example, sucrose, lactose, and maltose are the examples of disaccharides, but they may have either similar type of monosaccharides, which is in case of maltose, wherein two glucose units combine by alpha 1 fold linkage, giving rise to maltose. Whereas in case of galactose, we have two different sugars. The lactose, we have two different sugars, the galactose and the glucose, which are joined by the beta 1,4 linkage. Whereas in sucrose, there is a aldose sugar and a keto sugar. So the keto sugar is the fructose, and the aldose sugar is the glucose, which combine by alpha 1,2 linkage, giving rise to sucrose. So further, there are complex carbohydrates where not one or two, there are multiple units of monosaccharides. So these are called either oligosaccharides or polysaccharides, and the examples are starch, glycogen, and dietary fiber. If you look at the examples, the starch is the major, you know, carbohydrate source which we derive from the plants, and majority all our plant derived material which we consume are majorly the starch. For example, potatoes, and so these are the major storage forms in the plants which we consume. So the starch has multiple units um, of glucose, and there are two types basically: the amylose, which have long straight chains, so they are straight chains linked to one another by alpha 1 4 linkage, or amylopectin, wherein we have a branched chain by alpha 1 6 linkage of two glucose residues. So in case of amylopectin, there is a branch at every 24th or 30th glucose residues which are linked by alpha 1 6 linkage, and majority, about 80% of the dietary calories are provided to humans worldwide by starch. So the next is the glycogen. So unlike the starch, the glycogen is the animal storage carbohydrate which is derived from animals, and where it is stored, you find this in the liver and the muscles. So the major storage carbohydrate in animals is glycogen, and these are linked also by alpha 1 4 linkage. But unlike the starch, wherein after 24 to 30 units of glucose there is one branch point, but here we have after 8 every 4 to 8 glucose residues there is a alpha 1 6 linkage. So the glycogen has a lot of branches, more branches than the starch, because our body needs glucose very fast, so there are more branches, so the each glucose unit can be released quickly, so that our body requirement can be met. So this has less osmotic pressure, and it can be easily mobilized to provide energy to the body. How does the digestion takes place? So majorly the digestion takes place in the before the stomach, pre-stomach, by the salivary amylase, so which is a alpha 1 4 endoglycosidase. So the amylase, so the salivary amylase acts on the starch, and wherever there is a branched chain, so it gives rise to three kinds of molecules. It can give rise to either disaccharides such as maltose, or it can give rise to oligosaccharides such as maltotriose, or it can give rise to short stretches of small branched units called alpha limit dextrins. In the stomach, not much carbohydrate digestion takes place, but because the carbohydrates are also complexed with proteins, so the acid and the pepsin will unfold the proteins which are also complex with the carbohydrates. The ruminants have the animals which eat grass have four stomachs with extensive microbes such as bacteria to break down, and they anaerobically ferment the feed and thereby convert it into glucose. In the small intestine, the next level of digestion takes place by pancreatic enzymes such as alpha amylase. So what does this do? So both the amylase, which is the straight chain of glucose, and amylopectin, which are the branched chain of glucose, are acted by alpha amylase, and then they convert in them into maltose or the oligosaccharides such as maltotriose or limit dextrins. So the large units, they will convert them into shorter stretches of multimers actually. So further, the oligosaccharide digestion, the limit dextrins which have a branched chain are further acted upon by the glucoamylase or the maltase, and then they remove the terminal glucose here, and then they shorten the chain by one glucose. So these are further acted by alpha dextrinase, and then the till the branched chain, the another glucose unit is removed, and this keep on acting till there is a straight chain which is the maltotriose, and from maltotriose, when you remove one more glucose, it becomes maltose, and then individual units of glucose are obtained by the action of sucrase. So in the small intestine, there is a portal for transport of all the nutrients. So the small intestine have this brush border, epithelial cells, and wherein all the nutrients are absorbed inside, and they have a basolateral cell membrane on the bottom, right? So there are water and electrolyte balance which need to be maintained, and here there are several organelles, the rough endoplasmic reticulum and mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, nucleus. These are long cells, and further, so the enzymes associated with this, the intestinal surface membranes, are sucrase, alpha dextrinase, glucoamylase, lactase, and peptidases. So what happens? So this is the side of, intestinal lumen, inside the lumen side wherein our food is present, and these have multiple types of transporters such as GLUT5 is one of the transporter which transports the fructose inside the cell. On the other hand, there are glucose, sodium symport system. So wherein the glucose and the sodium both gets transported inside the cell, and these are further, absorbed in the bloodstream, which is towards the basolateral side. So there are these transporters, the sodium glucose symport system and the GLUTs. They help us in the absorption of these monosaccharides in the small intestine. So these are hexose transporters. So further, the carbohydrate malabsorption. So there may be people who have lactose intolerance or hypolactasia. So there is a decline in the lactase with age. So this happens when the beta-1,4 linkage between the galactose and glucose cannot be broken further, giving rise to monomeric units. So the lactase, there will be more of the problem like gas and volatile fatty acids are synthesized, and the water retention leading to diarrhea and bloating. Not all populations are susceptible, but mostly the northern European people, they so and the Asian, African Americans, it is more higher. So the metabolism is nothing but the chemical changes that takes place in the cell that produce energy and the basic materials which are needed for important life processes. So we have millions of cells in our body. There are multiple organ systems such as liver, heart, brain, adipose tissue, and there are thousands of enzymes which are present in these organs, and we have several types of conditions when we are fasting, we are eating food which is called as a fed state, we have an exercise state. So we have several types of states or conditions. So carbohydrates serve as the primary source of energy in the cell, and it is central to all the metabolic processes. The central to all metabolic processes is in the cytosol, where the anaerobic you know respiration takes place, and therein wherein the glucose gets converted to glucose 6 phosphate, and the further by the process of glycolysis gets converted to 3 carbon molecule, because glucose has 6 carbons, the pyruvate has half of it, which is 3 carbons. And this glucose, when it gets converted to glucose 6 phosphate, can also give rise to glucose 1 phosphate by just transfer from the 6th position phosphate to the 1st position phosphate. And also glucose is a source of pentose phosphate shunt, means pentose phosphate means 5 sugars, so 5 carbon sugars. So this also is a source of 5 carbon sugars. So we have cytosolic part, and wherein the pyruvate is produced by the glycolysis, and then there is a mitochondrial part, mitochondrial. So this pyruvates get transported, and where in mitochondria aerobic metabolism takes place, and it participates in the Krebs cycle, and it produces the reducing equivalents, and there is you know amino acid production, and then there are other reducing equivalents which are being utilized. We also have fatty acid synthesis and degradation. So we have several conditions. One is the metabolism taking place only in the cytosol, such as the such as the glycolysis and the pentose phosphate pathway and the lactate which is being produced in the cytosol. There is other condition wherein this pyruvate gets transported and participates in the TCA cycle, which we will cover in the later classes. So this produces the many reducing equivalents which is present in the brain. So the first system, for example, red blood cell has no mitochondria. So this is an example of red blood cell. In case of muscle, so both the systems operate, so both the cytosolic as well as the mitochondrial. So we have glucose, we have glycogen, we have lactate. So muscle has both the glycogen and the lactate. That's why when we run long distances, we have fatigueness in our muscles. And the last, the full Monty, is the liver. So liver is the place where all sorts of metabolism and detoxification process takes place. So wherein we have the cytoplasmic, metabolism, which we see in here, along with the mitochondrial metabolism, which is also seen. So during the fasting state, what happens is the the amount of glucose 6 phosphate formed is much higher, and then further breaking down into the 3 carbon molecules such as pyruvate doesn't happen because we need we have less of glucose, so we need to produce other things. So we have to produce other energy sources which are non-carbohydrate sources, because we are fasting, because we are not consuming any carbohydrates now. So in this state, we have other types of molecules which are being produced other than the pyruvate, right? So this needs about 13.8 kilojoules per mole of energy, and and further, so there are different sorts of enzymes which happens because there is a reversal of glycolysis. So which we call as gluconeogenesis. So the controlling of this metabolic flux happens at the control of various enzymes and the control of various enzyme activities, and which happens by activation and inhibition systems. So these, the glucose 6 phosphate which we spoke, can either get converted to glucose 1 phosphate, or it can get converted to glycogen via the UDP glucose. So this is an introductory class. I will not cover the details, but we will have separate topic for each of these metabolisms. Okay. What I wanted to show is there are various enzymes, and there is a rate limiting step which is being controlled during the regulation of this process. And also there are hormones such as insulin comes into picture. Insulin, when it's binded to its receptor, insulin receptor, have a cascade of phosphorylation step using kinase. So kinase is the enzyme which always participate in the phosphorylation reactions. So you see here protein kinase B is in the inactive state, becomes active, which further acts on the glycogen synthase kinase, which also from the active state becomes inactive. So the phosphorylation can be either way. So the activation can be by addition of phosphate or by the removal of phosphate. Inactivation might also might happen also. So both the things, activation and inactivation, could happen for different enzymes differently by addition of a phosphate group. So further, the glycogen formation is regulated by glycogen synthase, wherein the active form is the non-phosphorylated form. So this controlling the metabolic flux is by control of enzyme activity, compartmentalization. For example, the fatty acid oxidation occurs in the mitochondrial matrix, and the fatty acid synthesis occurs in the endoplasmic reticulum membrane exposed to the cytoplasm of the cell, and the hormonal regulation such as the insulin, glucagon, epinephrine might take place. So different tissues could have different types of metabolic systems, such as muscle and cardiac. And so here, the breakdown of glycogen takes place during the fasting state, and in the adipose and the liver tissue. So the glucose is getting converted to glycerol, and because adipose tissue is the place where the fats are being stored, so the triglyceride synthesis might takes place here. So in the nervous system, always they use glucose. Like I said, brain requires the highest amount of glucose in the whole body, and always the glucose supply should not stop. So So this is very important for the nervous system and for the reproductive or the memory system. So the glucose is required by the fetus as well. And the red blood cells has no mitochondria, so they oxidize glucose to the lactate, and lactate will return to the liver for production of energy by non-glycolytic